St. Margaret sat on the cliffs like it had always been there. Its stone bones gray with salt and silence, its chapel roof crooked from decades of storms, its bell tower long rusted shut. By 1841, no one from the outside world visited except the butcher, the coffinman, and the priest sent once a month from the diocese in Bangor. The convent wasn't spoken of often, not because it was evil, but because it was forgettable. The nuns inside had vowed themselves to God in obscurity. The townsfolk nearby called them the white moths, since they were only ever seen walking the gardens at dusk, drifting in slow, identical lines like quiet insects drawn to dying light. But on Easter Sunday that year, something changed, something too quiet, too perfect. The morning began with normality. 19 nuns, all in white, entered the stone chapel in silence. They followed the order, the youngest first, the eldest last. They carried nothing, said nothing. No one recalled hearing the chapel bell ring, though it should have. Inside the building, cold candles lined the pews, and the air was thick with the scent of dried myrrh. According to the record left by the sole surviving priest, Father Varick, the Mass began at the 7th hour with the reading of the Gospel and continued for 94 minutes. He wrote that the nuns sang their final hymn with eyes lowered, voices thin and harmonious like reeds blowing over a frozen river. But what unsettled him, what confused him deeply, was the final silence. When the hymn ended, it did not echo. No sound bounced off the walls. The chapel seemed to devour it whole. And when he looked up again, all 19 were gone. There were no footsteps, no sound of doors. The heavy iron lock on the chapel entrance hadn't shifted. Father Varick said he walked the length of the pews twice, then 3 times, calling out softly in disbelief. The veils remained neatly folded on the seats, one by one, as if each woman had slipped backward through the pews and left no dust behind. There were no screams, no struggle, no blood, no sense that anything at all had happened, except for the oppressive absence of presence. He later wrote, "It was as if God had unchosen them." The doors were torn open shortly after noon. Villagers arrived slowly, unsure why they felt pulled to the hill that day. Some claimed the air had grown thick and difficult to breathe. Others said their children had nightmares the night before of black vines curling through the chapel windows. When they entered, they found Father Varick on his knees before the altar, whispering incoherently and trying to swallow the church's last communion wafer. He would never speak a clear sentence again. What they didn't find were the nuns, not one. Their beds were made, their shoes lined up neatly beneath the straw-matted frames. A single bowl of boiled oats had been left to rot in the kitchen. One of the windows was cracked but untouched from the inside. That night, the wind pushed violently against the chapel door, but the lock held. The only sound heard from inside was the faint clatter of something metallic falling repeatedly from a great height, though no one could agree whether it sounded like chains or coins or keys. The local sheriff ordered a full sweep the next morning. Dogs refused to enter. A ladder lowered into the crypt beneath the altar found nothing but bone dust and burnt petals. There were no secret tunnels, no evidence of intrusion, and no remains. But in the choir loft above the pews, hidden behind the organ's hollowed casing, they found something strange. 19 wax figures, crudely shaped but disturbingly detailed, sitting shoulder to shoulder with their heads bowed. Each figure had a small cavity in the chest, and inside each, buried deep within the wax, was a tooth. Humans, polished, tiny. The figures were warm to the touch. After that, the convent was sealed. Bishop Adriel of the Bangor Diocese ordered the area sanctified and silenced. No reports were made to the broader church, no exhumations, no mass. The 19 women were simply recorded as assumed deceased by miraculous disappearance, and their names were folded into the Easter litany as those whom God reclaimed. No gravestones were laid. Only a heavy iron gate now bars the chapel doors, and a wooden sign nailed to it reads, in red, no singing after dusk, but some nights, especially around Easter, the townsfolk say they hear voices coming from the cliffs, not screams, not crying, just singing, soft and sweet and muffled as if coming from beneath a floor of stone. Elsie Denim had worked in the village tax office for 41 years. Her hands shook when she wrote, and her knees ached in winter, but her mind was still exact, trained on columns, careful with ink, unbending when numbers didn't add up. She had processed the land and trade records for nearly every chapel, school, and graveyard from the coast to the inland mills. And in all her years of accounting for the church's shadow, she had never once questioned what they claimed in ink. Until St. Margaret's. The convent's final quarterly manifest before the disappearances was different. It had no flour, no lamp oil, no books. Instead, it listed shipments of wrought iron slabs, copper piping in unnatural lengths, and 2 barrels marked for preservation purposes only. What made her stop completely was the last line, an order signed for 6 satchels of teeth, all marked milk, partial, assorted. She checked the ledger twice, then a third time. It wasn't a metaphor, it wasn't code. These were human teeth, delivered to a house of God. The order had been approved not through the usual diocesan channels, but by a single signatory, Cipriana H., stamped in crimson wax. Elsie didn't recognize the name at first, but later remembered hearing a rumor that the Mother Superior at St. Margaret's never spoke aloud. Only signed, only watched. There were no receipts attached to the convent's order. No customs clearance. The supplier listed was a shuttered dental practice in Belfast that had burned down 3 winters ago. She circled the page and filed it in the bottom drawer of her desk, meaning to forget it by Monday. But she didn't. She couldn't. The next day, she walked into the parish office and asked to speak to Father Murrin, who handled the convent's financial oversight. She showed him the shipment manifest and explained that several items were not only unaccounted for but legally restricted, particularly embalming salts in such quantities. She smiled as she spoke, carefully trying to pretend it was a matter of compliance. But the priest didn't even glance at the paper. He folded it once, tucked it into his coat, and told her gently that some sins were protected by canon. Then he placed his hand on her shoulder for a moment too long and said that God would rather she prayed for the silent than made noise on their behalf. That was the last time Elsie ever saw the document. But she did not stop digging. She went home that night and pulled out her old private ledgers, ones she'd kept quietly for personal curiosity. Unsanctioned copies of tax slips and inventories, names and numbers that whispered too loudly to ignore. She found that over a span of 16 months, St. Margaret's had received irregular deliveries, animal tranquilizers labeled as sedative herbals, copper wire used in heart defibrillators, and 13 separate orders of iron braces typically used in limb correction, though no patient records existed to justify them. Most disturbingly, she discovered the convent had purchased several pieces of early galvanic equipment, a primitive form of electrical stimulation developed for spiritual awakening in comatose patients. The invoices had been routed through an apothecary front in Paris, yet the deliveries arrived via merchant boats known to dock at Black Hollow Cove, 2 miles from the convent. No one watched Black Hollow. No one asked questions. Elsie began to understand something terrible, not just that the church had looked the other way, but that it had funded the looking. The supplies weren't for healing. They weren't for repair. They were instruments of method, scientific, medical, spiritual, all fused into one cruel logic, to sanctify pain under the veil of piety. It was not punishment. It was a ceremony. Whatever happened in the sealed chapel of St. Margaret's had been calculated to the smallest tooth. She took her findings to the mayor's office the next week. The receptionist told her the mayor had gone north for a funeral. She returned the next week. Still gone. The following morning, her home was broken into. Nothing was taken, but her desk drawers had been carefully emptied and reordered. On her kitchen table was a single communion wafer, burnt on one edge, slightly curled. Elsie Denim retired in silence the following month. She told no one what she had found, and the ledgers disappeared. But a boy who helped her carry her things on her last day would later say that her eyes never blinked while she looked at the chapel from the hilltop. He said she muttered something once, something he didn't understand until much later. God may not speak here anymore, but something else does. In the cold belly of St. Margaret's, beneath the chapel where the hymns once floated and the iron pipes moaned with winter wind, there was a locked door few knew existed. Beyond it lay a narrow stairwell lined with salt-blackened candles and walls smeared with a chalky paste made of ash and crushed barley. At the bottom was a room with no windows and no natural air, and in it lived a woman the others did not speak of by name. Sister Elodia had not seen the sun in nearly 9 years. She did not eat with the others, nor did she sleep in a bed. Her food came once a day in a bowl slid through a grate, always cold, always white, boiled rice, flour paste, dried figs. Her hands were permanently stained with an ink that was not ink. Her skin had the color of damp paper, and she did not speak, not by choice but by vow. A vow older than canon, older than the convent. A vow she had been forced into on the 3rd night of her novitiate when she was only 16 and bled longer than the others. The blood had not stopped, and then one day, it never returned. The church called her a sign, not of God but of what came before. She was the only one among them who did not bleed, not monthly, not from wounds, not even under punishment. The sisters believed her body had crossed into something inhuman. Her veins felt hollow beneath the skin. Her eyes never blinked during storms. Her presence in the convent had become a contradiction. She was at once a miracle and a warning. The other nuns were forbidden to look directly at her if they passed her chamber. She was kept locked below, not as punishment but as preservation. For the ritual demanded a vessel that could hold both silence and time. They called it the 40-hour seed, and it began with isolation. Elodia's role was not chosen. It had been written long before she was born, in an obscure footnote to a vanished prayer book discovered behind a burned altar in a monastery ruined by plague. The rite demanded that one woman once marked as pure empty be sealed from the cycles of women severed from voice and appetite and made ready for what they called the infusion. It was not sexual, nor was it spiritual in any modern sense. It was an act of reordering. For 40 hours, beginning at dusk and ending at the second sun after, her body would be used not as a body but as a field. Into her were poured ashes of teeth, oils scraped from candle soot, and the melted brass of former sacraments. Her arms were bound not to restrain her, but to prevent her from touching herself and breaking the ritual flow. Her eyes were kept open by iron pins laid flat against the skin. Her mouth held shut by thorns of vine boiled until soft, then dried against the tongue. Every sensation had to be felt. Every nerve had to be counted. The others called this sacred. She never did. The walls of her room were carved with repeating symbols, interlocking rings, some floral, others shaped like severed tongues. Beneath her cot was a hollowed space where earlier vessels had been buried, small cloth parcels, each containing a piece of bone, a lock of hair, a finger. They were not hers, but she was told she would join them one day. The night before the disappearances, she heard footsteps, 19 of them descending the chapel steps one after the other, quiet as sleepwalkers. She felt no fear, only the pressure of expectation, the weight of eyes on a life that had long stopped being hers. They came bearing nothing but oil lamps and song. The song had no words. It was a chant passed between centuries, never written, only hummed by those ready to cross over. She sat on the floor in silence, as she had been trained to do. But that night the ritual was different. The lamps were left unlit. The doors remained open, and for the first time the nuns surrounded her, not in worship, not in care, but in fear. They had seen something in her they no longer believed they could control, a stillness that no longer served them, a silence too deep to be holy. In their eyes, she had become the ritual, not the vessel. She had absorbed too much. She had swallowed too many offerings. She had become the mouth of the rite itself, and they knew what that meant. The ritual could no longer be repeated, only completed. What they did in that room was never written. But after that night, there were no nuns left to carry the rite forward. Only Sister Elodia remained, alone in the dark, her body unmarked, her silence unbroken. They had left her there with their last breath. And when the chapel doors were sealed the next day, no one knew she was still below, still breathing, still waiting. She who does not bleed has become she who must not be spoken of. Beneath the chapel crypt, below the shelves of broken chalices and relics sealed away from public eyes, lay a chamber never listed in the convent's plans. The door was hidden behind a false wall of limestone, its edges packed with dust and salt to disguise the draft of heat that leaked from within. When investigators finally broke it open decades later, they stepped into a space unlike any other in St. Margaret's. The air was heavy with scorched iron, clotted incense, and something darker that clung to stone like marrow. At the center stood rows of metal frames, low, narrow beds forged of steel and carved with religious icons so intricate they were both beautiful and horrifying. Crucifixes rose from headrests, sharp enough to pierce the back of a skull. Rosary chains were welded into grates that pressed against the skin like branding irons. The steel was blackened in places, polished in others, showing where flesh had burned and where bodies had writhed long enough to polish the metal smooth. This was Mother Cipriana's reliquary furnace. To her it was no torture chamber but a holy workshop where human imperfection could be reformed through fire and iron. She preached to her sisters that sin was not washed away by water, nor by confession but by extraction, pulled out like poison, refined like ore. She believed the soul was trapped in layers of impurity, and only through controlled agony could it be freed to ascend. To Cipriana, every mark the body carried was a relic in the making, every scar a testament worthy of veneration. The more elaborate the wound, the closer to sanctity it became. The beds themselves revealed her method. Each one had beneath it a slow-burning trough where coal and incense ash were mingled, producing not flames but a steady radiance of suffocating heat. Victims were bound to the steel, their arms and legs spread along iron beams etched with scripture. As the hours passed, the heat seeped through the engraved letters and into the skin, branding holy words onto living flesh without ever scorching it outright. The pain was not meant to kill swiftly. It was meant to last, to keep the victim aware and trembling as the body sweated and the skin fused with the shapes of sacred text. Cipriana would recite passages of Eucharistic doctrine during these sessions, insisting that their bodies were undergoing transubstantial purification, that their very sinew was becoming something higher, something incorruptible. To her twisted mind, she was not defiling the body. She was crafting relics. Each bed had trays where the sweat of the suffering was collected, stored in small crystal vials and sealed with wax. These vials were labeled with saints' names as though the nuns bound upon the furnaces were already canonized by their pain. Once the ordeal was deemed complete, the sisters were lifted from the steel. Sometimes alive, sometimes broken beyond life, they were washed in salt water and wrapped in linens marked with crimson thread. Those who survived bore words etched into their flesh, permanent sermons written by metal and fire. Those who died were not buried. Their bones were ground to dust, mixed with wax and shaped into devotional candles. Cipriana believed she had discovered the final sacrament, one not recognized by Rome, the sacrament of pain. It was an alchemy of body and faith, a ritual to prove that suffering was not punishment but raw material for transformation. To outsiders, she was a gentle mother superior, serene, rarely raising her voice. She was known for her steady hands in embroidery, for her skill in gardening roses that bloomed even through harsh winters. No one who met her could have imagined she spent nights in the reliquary furnace, stoking coals and watching her sisters shiver and convulse upon beds of steel scripture. The worst detail lay in her writings. Hidden in the margins of her breviary, investigators later found notes where she described the furnace as a bridal chamber. She wrote of the nuns as brides of Christ who must consummate their vows not through love but through agony. Their wedding beds forged of iron, their rings engraved into their skin. She believed herself chosen as midwife to this sacred consummation, guiding them into new forms, ushering them into eternity through engineered torment. No one ever saw her fury, no one saw her hands bloodied. Her cruelty was methodical, silent, hidden behind ritual and prayer. And that made it worse. For Mother Cipriana did not think herself wicked. She thought herself holy. The Sisters of St. Margaret's had long performed their rituals in ways that drifted from orthodoxy. But under Mother Cipriana's rule, the old devotion was twisted into something new, something unspeakable. She had taken the stations of the cross, the holy sequence of Christ's suffering, and rewritten them into a ritual of human reenactments. 19 stations, not 14. 19 women, each one bound to a fate designed to echo his agony but made darker, stranger, and irreversible. To her, it was not blasphemy. It was perfection. Each sister becoming a living emblem of pain, a relic carved into flesh, a sacrifice that could never be undone. The first station was no longer Jesus condemned, but the bride chosen. A young nun was taken and sealed in a chamber of mirrors, each etched with thin cruciform scratches. She stood upright, never allowed to sit, her body slowly weakened by fasting. Every angle of her reflection reminded her that she was watched by 1,000 tiny crucifixes, her body reflected and cut apart by the glass itself. Days passed until her image became distorted, her own outline dissolving into fragments. Her end came not by wounds but by the surrender of her mind. Another was assigned to the station they called the Pillar of Breath. She was placed into the organ loft, her torso pierced carefully through with narrow brass pipes that entered beneath her ribs and emerged from her back. Air was forced through the pipes by bellows, creating a mournful harmony with every shallow movement of her lungs. Her pain became sound, a hymn of wheezing chords. The sisters below were told to kneel as if listening to a sermon, while the living instrument above strained against each note until silence claimed her lungs. Cipriana believed this was holy music. Suffering turned into harmony. Others were entombed in ways more grotesque. At the candle wall, a nun was lowered into a hollow niche. Her arms at her sides, her body sealed upright with dripping layers of wax. Candle after candle was melted against her skin until she was encased in a hardened tomb, frozen in prayer with her lips pressed shut. The wax was translucent enough that her outline could still be seen. Her eyes open, her figure lit faintly by the very candles that imprisoned her. She did not scream. She could not. Only the faint heat of wax and the tightening pressure of suffocation remained. For Mother Cipriana, this was purification through stillness, flesh turned to votive. There was a station called the Bearing of Silence. Here a nun was forced to crawl endlessly on her knees around the chapel floor, weighted down by an iron yoke shaped like a monstrance. It was not lifted from her even at night. Her flesh split, her knees flayed, but she was commanded never to cry out. The ritual demanded her silence be absolute, for Cipriana taught that true holiness was the ability to suffer unheard. When her voice finally broke into a sob, she was declared unworthy and left beneath the yoke until her body stilled. Every station became a methodical sermon in steel, wax, or bone. The nails was not the driving of spikes into hands, but the steady insertion of sharpened quills into nerve clusters, meant to write God's name in pain across the nervous system. The burial did not mean a tomb of stone, but a pit lined with salt where a nun was lowered naked, the salt leaching every drop of fluid from her until her body became brittle, a living relic drying into dust. Each sister's end was not sudden but prolonged, designed with precision so her suffering could be witnessed, catalogued and understood as both punishment and offering. 19 women, 19 stations, each one consumed by a ritual more elaborate than the last. And in the twisted theology of Mother Cipriana, this sequence was not meant to be remembered. It was meant to be repeated again and again, each new generation of sisters filling the stations with their own bodies. The rewritten passion was not history, it was machinery. A cycle of torment disguised as faith, a system of pain in which flesh was scripture and screams were gospel. And for those outside the convent, no one knew. To the village, the sisters were silent, holy, and devout. Behind the chapel walls, they had been turned into living icons of suffering, each one extinguished in a station they could never leave. When the chapel of St. Margaret's was finally unsealed in the late 19th century, the first thing noticed was not the silence, but the marks on the floor. Beneath the pews, hidden by warped planks of oak, lay thin iron rings fixed into the stone. At first they were dismissed as anchors for benches, but when a forensic historian named Dr. Alaric Fenwick examined them decades later, he saw the pattern. 19 rings, each one spaced exactly 6 feet apart, forming a circle that mirrored the stations of the cross painted on the chapel walls above. He knew then that the pews had not been built for prayer, but to disguise something else entirely. Carefully he pried away the flooring, revealing stains etched deep into the stone. Not red, not the thick iron hue of blood, but pale impressions like shadows of salt. At the center of each mark was a faint outline, oval, contoured, shaped like the press of a human face. These were not accidents. They were the remains of a ritual. Fenwick traced them to the tools later discovered in the crypt. Silver masks, molded with serene expressions, their lips closed, their eyes half shut as if caught in eternal prayer. Each mask had narrow tubes fitted inside, not for air to pass through, but to deny it. The victims who wore them would breathe shallowly until there was nothing left to draw, their suffocation disguised as holiness. Cipriana's theology named this practice the bloodless sacrament. To her mind, blood was corruption, the mark of Eve's failing, the sign of flesh's weakness. True purity could not be achieved through bleeding, for bleeding was natural, and natural was impure. Instead, she taught that life must be taken without wound, without spill, so that the body remained whole as it was delivered to God. The silver masks became her chalices. She fastened them over the sisters' faces, tightening straps until skin folded inward, and she told them that every gasp they fought against was envy being drained from their lungs. To make sure, she used tools of her own design, small cruciform blades, each one forged to press against a nerve point. Behind the ears, between the ribs, at the base of the spine, the blades were sharp but not deep. They pricked without cutting. They pierced pressure without drawing blood. Pain surged without evidence. The result was agony that left no trace. The victims' bodies bore no bruises, no open wounds, no pools of red for the world to question. They simply stopped, their faces serene under silver, their bodies collapsing into silence as if they had chosen to go. Cipriana called this release. To her it was the ultimate communion, a taking of the spirit without the stain of flesh, a transformation so clean it could be displayed openly. She left the masks on their faces long after death, arranging their hands in prayer, as though the women had fallen asleep in devotion. To outsiders it would look like holy repose. Only those within the convent knew the truth. Fenwick documented his findings with care, but even he admitted that what unsettled him most were the scratches inside the masks. Fine grooves carved into the silver where teeth had clenched, where nails had scraped against metal in desperate final moments. Every victim had resisted. Everyone had fought for a last breath that was denied them. And yet their bodies left behind no crimson, no spectacle. The bloodless sacrament was cruelty perfected into invisibility. It could be repeated endlessly, and no outsider would suspect that the Sisters of St. Margaret's had been turned into instruments of silent death. In his final report, Fenwick wrote that suffocation is not the absence of life, but the presence of terror stretched thin across time. He concluded that Cipriana must have delighted not in their deaths, but in their silence, the moment where the will to live was smothered beneath ritual calm. That was the essence of her theology. Holiness was not the giving of breath, but its removal. And though the floor has since been scrubbed and sealed, the faint outlines of those 19 faces still remain, pressed into stone like shadows of prayer that never ended. It was here, in this hidden liturgy of oxygen and silver, that the Mother Superior perfected her belief, that only in a body drained of voice, blood, and breath could she see the face of God. Behind the convent walls, hidden past the kitchen gardens where carrots and leeks once grew, lay another enclosure no visitor ever spoke of. It was called the Cloister Garden, though no record of it existed in parish books. Overgrown now with nettles and bramble, it once held a precise geometry. 19 stone figures arranged in a circle, each life-sized, each a perfect rendering of a nun frozen in devotion. At first glance, they seemed no different from the marble saints in any cathedral courtyard. Their habits were carved with folds so delicate one could mistake them for cloth. Their fingers were pressed in prayer, their lips drawn closed, their eyes lifted toward a heaven that had long since closed its gaze. Yet what set them apart was not their artistry but their presence. Each statue radiated something that unnerved those who looked too long. Their faces were too specific. Their proportions are too exact. These were not icons of imagined saints. These were bodies remembered in stone with unsettling intimacy. When investigators dug below them, they discovered the truth. The statues were not stone at all, but shells, coatings of lime and ash layered over preserved flesh. The corpses of the 19 missing nuns had been encased upright, their skin hardened by quicklime poured carefully over days, sealing them into rigid forms. Under the crust, their bodies had not decayed. They had been preserved, their bones fused into minerals, their flesh turned to brittle husks beneath a mask of white. Cipriana had not buried them. She had displayed them, turning their deaths into a garden of permanence, a silent congregation locked forever in worship. But the most horrifying detail was found in their faces. Each statue bore eyes that glistened faintly, not carved, not painted, but real. Human eyes removed from their sockets and fixed into stone, preserved with salts and resin until their gaze remained glassy and eternal. The effect was ghastly. Statues that seemed alive, watching, their stares unblinking as the years passed. This was the garden's secret. To the villagers who once glimpsed it through the gates, the figures seemed holy. Uncanny perhaps, but devotional. To those who uncovered it later, it was a cemetery without graves, a reliquary that breathed without moving. Cipriana had called it her orchard. In her journals hidden in the reliquary furnace, she wrote that the body was too fragile, too easily lost to earthworms and rot. But the stone endured. Lime ate away weakness, ash sealed away corruption. By encasing her sisters, she believed she had delivered them into eternity intact, their forms preserved until the Last Judgment. The eyes, she explained, were necessary. Stone was blind. To sanctify the vessel, sight had to remain. She wrote that without eyes the soul would wander. With eyes, even in death, it would continue to witness God. And so she replaced marble or glass with the very organs of those she entombed, giving each statue the power to see what flesh could no longer endure. For her, the garden was not a monument but a choir of witnesses. Every morning she walked among them, brushing away weeds, polishing their stone habits, speaking prayers into ears that could no longer hear. She believed the statues held their spirits captive, and that as long as she tended them, the sisters would remain her silent flock. It was devotion reimagined as ownership, an eternal convent where obedience never faltered and silence never broke. The horror was not only in the act but in its serenity. She had made her victims beautiful, eternal, and submissive, locked in a posture of prayer they could never escape. The garden itself became a place of unease. Birds never landed on the statues. Insects avoided them. Even the ivy that swallowed the chapel walls would not creep over their faces. Locals who passed at night swore the figures seemed to shift. Their heads turned slightly, their eyes reflecting candlelight that wasn't there. When storms blew across the coast, the wind carried through the hollow garden with a sound that was neither whistle nor moan, but something like breath drawn through teeth. It was said that if you stood too close, you would feel the weight of 19 stairs pressing into you until you looked away. By the time the convent was abandoned, the garden was locked behind iron gates, its statues left to weather and crumble. Yet even as the lime cracked and the ash flaked, the eyes remained intact, staring out from hollow sockets, refusing to disintegrate. They became relics in their own right, harvested secretly by collectors, passed in silence between hands that never admitted what they held. To this day, some claim those eyes survive in hidden reliquaries watching from the dark. The Garden of Still Eyes was the clearest expression of Cipriana's madness. It was not enough for her victims to die. They had to endure. They had to stand forever in postures of obedience, their gazes fixed on an absent God, their bodies petrified into sermons no voice could ever recite. To her it was love, to history it was desecration beyond forgiveness, and the garden still waits, overgrown, its statues half buried, its eyes unblinking, holding their silent vigil for no one at all. The jar was small, glass, sealed tight with a crumbling wax emblem. It was hidden behind the altar, wedged between 2 blocks of aged stone that had not been disturbed for decades. The curious hands of an investigator unearthing the sacred space beneath the church revealed it almost by accident. At first, they thought it was another relic, an artifact untouched by time. But when they broke the seal, the contents were more unsettling than any ancient artifact could have been. Inside the jar lay a yellowed piece of parchment, fragile and warped, the ink smudged in places but legible enough to understand. The handwriting was elegant, looping, practiced. More than that, it was cold, precise and revealing. This was no confession of a sinner, no plea for salvation. It was the final testament of Mother Cipriana, The woman who had twisted the convent into a shrine to suffering, a place where every breath was designed to purge, every heartbeat to atone. She had written of her belief that the nuns of St. Margaret's were God's moths, creatures drawn instinctively to the flame, fragile and weak, eager for the destruction that would cleanse them. She wrote of how she had come to understand that only through total surrender, the surrender of body, mind, and spirit, could their femininity be purified. She believed that sin was rooted in the very essence of womanhood, that the female body with its blood, its desire, its weakness was tainted. But the soul could be saved. The body, though, had to be broken, forced into perfection through unbearable means. She had called it the 40-hour bride, a ritual she had devised to sanctify the body through the ultimate test of endurance. It involved 19 of the convent's nuns, each one carefully selected for their purity, their devotion, their unquestioning obedience. For 40 hours they would endure a torment so precise, so excruciating that the only way to survive it was through complete and utter submission to their suffering. The ritual began in silence. Each nun was stripped of her habit and laid upon a table constructed of iron and wood, her body bound not in restraint but in preparation for the coming fire. She would not move, she would not speak, and for 40 hours she would be denied sleep, denied food, denied comfort. The hours would stretch endlessly as Cipriana and the other nuns chanted around her, their voices low, hypnotic, the words indistinguishable, repeating a prayer that was never written down, only spoken aloud in the ritual's feverish rhythm. It was not a prayer to God, it was a prayer to suffering. As the hours passed, the nuns were subjected to increasingly painful methods, all calculated to push the boundaries of human endurance. Thin silver needles were placed beneath their nails, forcing the blood to seep from the skin in slow, agonizing rivulets. Their skin was branded with hot iron, not enough to kill, but enough to leave permanent scars that could be counted as proof of their devotion. Their senses were manipulated, eyes sewn shut, ears filled with wax, tongues swabbed with bitter, burning herbs. Every sense was assaulted, every comfort removed. Each nun's body became a battlefield of unbearable sensations, each hour a slow death of the will. Cipriana believed that by enduring this, by allowing their bodies to be broken in service to God's will, the nuns would become pure, their souls freed from the sin of their femininity. She believed that only through absolute suffering could they transcend the frailty of their human form and ascend to eternal grace. But there was a cost. In the final hours of the ritual, when the nuns were at their weakest, when their bodies had been pushed to the brink of collapse, Cipriana would remove the final veil. She would open their chests with a small, precise scalpel, and as their breath slowed, their hearts would be offered to God, not in blood, but in silence. Their sacrifice would be complete. For in Cipriana's twisted mind, to die in such a way, to give everything, heart, body, soul, without protest, without fight, was the purest form of love. She had believed with every fiber of her being that the nuns were chosen for this final act, that they were meant to burn themselves away to nothing, to be transformed into perfect vessels of holiness. To her, their agony was not torture, it was salvation. But the truth was darker, more damning than any of them had realized. Cipriana's mind had been consumed by the belief that only through breaking them, breaking their bodies, their wills, could she save them. She had turned them into instruments of her delusion, forcing them to become the very sacrifice she had convinced herself was necessary. And as the jar was sealed and the final words of her testament were read aloud, a chilling realization took hold. Cipriana had not seen her actions as monstrous. She had seen them as the last pure act of devotion. What she had done, what she had created, was not a covenant with God. It was a pact with her own madness, her own insatiable need to control, to purify, to destroy. And in the end, it was not salvation that awaited those 19 nuns. It was their souls, buried forever in the rubble of Cipriana's delusion. When they found Sister Elodia in 1853, she was no longer the girl who had entered St. Margaret's with bright eyes and soft hands. 12 years of silence had turned her into something else, something strange, caught between life and something far worse. She was found in the same cell where they had once locked her away to starve her body and purge her spirit. The room was as barren as it had been before, save for the markings she had etched into the stone walls with the tip of a splintered bone. 19 names, 19 women who had once stood by her side, nuns who had prayed, who had been broken, who had been made holy by Cipriana's twisted will. The names were followed by a single Latin phrase, Mulier voluntas Dei. Woman is the will of God. For 12 years that was all she had written, over and over, until the stone was worn smooth, until her hands bled from the effort of carving the words again and again. When they found her, she was sitting in the center of the room, her back straight, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the walls, somewhere far beyond the reaches of time. Her body was emaciated, her skin pale and stretched tight over bones, but her eyes, those eyes, still burned with something sharp, something that had not yet been dulled by the years. She had not spoken a word in over a decade. No cries for help, no pleas for mercy, no sound of any kind had passed her lips since the day they locked her away. But that silence was not peace. It was something darker, something far more sinister. The silence of St. Elodia was a punishment, a final surrender not just to the suffering she had endured, but to the mind that had orchestrated it all. She had been kept alive, kept untouched by death for one purpose, to bear witness. Her body was marked with the signs of her torment. There were scars from where the hot irons had branded her, thin, jagged lines from the needles that had been driven beneath her skin, and pale, faded cuts where the ropes had once bound her for hours on end. But there were also marks of something else, something she had not been able to escape from, no matter how much she had wanted to. Immunity. The same immunity that had allowed her to survive the crucible that had consumed the others. Her body had been turned into something that could endure, something that could suffer without breaking. And yet her mind had broken. She had learned to endure the pain, to let it wash over her without resistance, to offer herself up as a vessel to be used and emptied. But in the end, it was the silence that had consumed her. The silence that had filled her so completely that even when she was found, she could not speak of what she had witnessed, what she had endured. The nuns who had survived the ritual, the ones who had been left to carry Cipriana's madness forward, were long gone. Some had died, some had escaped, and some had simply disappeared into the shadows of history, their names forgotten like dust in the wind. But Elodia was still there. She had survived, but she had not been saved. When they found her, she was no longer a woman. She was a relic, a witness to something that had been lost, something too terrible to remember. The silence that had enveloped her was not just the absence of sound. It was the absence of everything, of faith, of hope, of humanity. It was the silence that comes when a person is hollowed out, when there is nothing left but the echo of what once was. And in the silence of St. Elodia, the only thing left was the memory of those who had gone before her, their names etched into the stone, their faces lost to the flames of Cipriana's madness. Elodia had become a vessel, but not for God. She had become a vessel for the broken remnants of a twisted mind, a mind that had convinced itself that suffering was salvation. And in the end, it was that mind, Cipriana's mind, that had killed them all, not with fire or blade, but with silence. Silence that stretched for years, for lifetimes, until it became the very air they breathed. When Elodia was found, she was not greeted as a martyr. She was not welcomed back as a saint. She was a casualty of a war that had been fought in the shadows, a war between faith and madness, between love and destruction. And when they asked her what had happened, when they begged her to speak of the horrors she had witnessed, she simply stared at them, her eyes empty and cold, as though the answers were buried somewhere too deep for words to reach. The silence, it seemed, had become her last refuge. And in that silence she had finally become one with the will of God. When the remains of the 19 nuns were unearthed, the full extent of their suffering became undeniable. Their bodies, preserved under layers of quicklime and holy ash, had been disturbed by the hands of men and women who could not look away. The remains were scattered among those who had lived to tell the story, or so it seemed. In the cold months that followed, the Vatican issued a decree. All evidence from St. Margaret's was to be sealed for the protection of the faithful. The Church claimed that to allow the public to see the true horrors of what had occurred would be to risk the sanctity of its sacred image. The faithful, it was said, should not be burdened with the gruesome truth. But even behind these walls of secrecy, whispers began to leak. Stories of those who had survived the broken silence of the convent, tales told in hushed voices by nuns who had escaped, by villagers who remembered shadows moving in the dark, by those who had witnessed things they dared not repeat. But these were only whispers, soft voices against a force that had silenced the past with one word: protection. The stone walls that had once shielded the secrets of St. Margaret's were not simply torn down. They were concealed under layers of holy absolution. The past was locked away, and those who sought answers were told to believe in faith alone. Yet in 1875, the weight of those whispers could no longer be ignored. A law was passed by the Vatican, the Ritual Containment Act, which officially banned the construction of ritual containment architecture in convents, monasteries, and other religious buildings. The law was broad, vague in its execution, but its meaning was clear. No more hidden chambers, no more sanctuaries built to imprison faith in silence. It was a law written under the weight of fear, a fear that the truth had been buried too deeply for too long. It was an attempt to protect what remained of the Church's image, to sanitize the past before it could be dug up again. But no law could erase the memory of what had been done. St. Margaret's was eventually abandoned, its foundation left to crumble under the weight of time. In its place, a stone memorial was erected, a simple slab of granite with no inscription, no names, just a plain surface that seemed to hold its breath. The memorial stood like a silent sentinel, its purpose unclear, its presence haunting. Some said it was for the nuns, others for the survivors, others still for those who had been lost in the shroud of faith that had consumed them all. But no one spoke the truth, and no one ever would. The memorial, much like the convent, was a place where nothing could be heard but the silence that echoed for years, the silence of the forgotten, the silence of the unspoken, the silence of the victims, their bodies left to decay beneath the earth, their souls left to twist in the dark. History had been buried, but it was not forgotten, not completely. It lingered like a shadow over the memorial, casting doubt on every prayer whispered in its direction, every mass held in its vicinity. The truth, however obscured, refused to be buried entirely. As the years passed, the silence around St. Margaret's grew louder. People began to question the meaning of what had happened. How had the Church allowed such a thing to unfold? How had the bodies of 19 women been treated so casually, so mercilessly? How had a mind so twisted, so cruel, been allowed to operate behind the guise of faith? In the stillness of the memorial, the question began to turn inward. What happens when faith becomes a weapon? What happens when those who are meant to protect the faithful become the very ones who harm them? And perhaps most terrifying of all, what happens when no one listens to the silent? When those who are broken, who suffer, who die in the name of righteousness are cast aside and ignored? Cipriana's actions were not the work of an isolated madwoman. She had been enabled by the very structure meant to uphold truth. The church had turned a blind eye, not because it did not know, but because it was easier to let the shadows grow than to bring them into the light. And so the victims, both the living and the dead, remained silent, their voices swallowed by the power that controlled them. The true horror of St. Margaret's was not simply the cruelty of one woman, but the cruelty of an institution that allowed such horrors to flourish behind closed doors. The world had moved on, but the question remained: could it happen again? In the corners of the church, in the hidden spaces between walls, the truth still waited. The silence once broken could never be fully repaired. What had been done could not be undone. The echoes of those who had been lost remained in the dark, a reminder that when heaven closes its eyes, the monsters are free to